So today we're looking at the 6-5. We're finding the inverse of a quadratic and a cubic function. So on Tuesday we did the linear functions. Today we're going to be focusing on, specifically, I'm only going to do the cubic functions today. And then tomorrow we'll do the quadratic functions. So the lesson today, 6-5, I'm splitting it into 2 days. So for our objective today, we can find the inverse of a quadratic and a cubic, but like I said, today we're only going to focus on the cubic functions. So for prior knowledge here, it says to find the inverse of f of x equals 2x minus 8. There isn't really a specific space for you guys to do it, but you can do it at the bottom, or you can do it like on the side of the text boxes for 6-5. So if you remember, our first step is to change f of x to y. And then our x and our y switch places. So y becomes x, and the x becomes a y. And then from here, you start solving. So remember, we're doing PEMDAS in reverse. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. In reverse. So first get rid of any addition or subtraction, then any multiplying or dividing. And then we don't really have exponents or parentheses here, so you can go ahead and try to solve this one. Okay, so this is a linear function. This is what we were doing the past 2 days, where you guys are getting the inverse of a linear. The process is going to be the same today. You're going to switch the function notation to y, and then switch the x and the y, and then solve for the new y, and then at the end write it again in function notation. It's going to be the same, except today we're going to add exponents because we're going to be having the quadratic and the cubic functions. Okay? So if we look at the concept here, it says that the inverse of a quadratic function, the x squared, is a square root function, the square root. And I'll kind of show you why over here on this underneath here. This is like a y equals a x squared. And if I find the inverse, I'm going to switch the y and the x. So this is going to become x equals y squared. And then to solve for the y, I got to get rid of the squared. So do you guys remember how to get rid of a squared? Square root each side, right? So then that way the square root cancels out the squared. And then you're going to be left with y equals the square root of x. Okay? So the f inverse function is going to be the square root function. This is what this is saying over here. The quadratic, if you start with the next squared, you will end up with a square root. Okay? Likewise, if we have the cubic, so the inverse of a cubic is a cube root. And it's kind of the same reasoning here. If I had a y equals a x cubed, switch the x and the y. And then how do we get rid of the cubed? Instead of taking the square root, I need to get rid of the cube, so it's called the cube root, where you put a little 3 as the index in the little radical, and then this is the cube root on this side. So then the cube root cancels out the cube, and then we would be left with the y equals cube root of x, and then switch it back to inverse. So I can see if I start with the x cubed, a cubic, I should end up with a cube root. Okay? So the inverse of a quadratic and x squared will give you a square root. The inverse of a cube would be a cube root. All right. So for our steps today are going to be the same like we did on the basically here. You're going to switch the function notation to y, switch the x and the y, solve for the new y, and then go back to inverse notation. That's going to be the same process, except we're going to have exponents today. So we have here the steps to find the inverse of any function is to first change the notation to y, just like we did yesterday or Tuesday. It was f of x switches to y. And then step 2, change x to y and y to x. So when we had our y equals 2x plus 3, the y becomes the x and the x becomes the y. And then our step 3 is to solve for the new y variable, get the y by itself. And then step 4, rewrite it using inverse notation. So like a f inverse or g inverse. So in step 3, you'll solve for y. You'll get like a y equals something. And then step 4, change the y back to an f inverse notation. So the process is the same like we did on Tuesday. The only difference now is we're going to have a whole bunch of stuff to get rid of, and you have to follow a specific order of things here, okay? So the procedure to solve an equation for a single variable is to first undo operations outside of the parentheses, okay? So first you get rid of anything outside of the parentheses by doing PEMDAS in reverse. So we have please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So first you get rid of addition and subtraction because we're doing this in reverse. So from bottom to top. And then you guys need to get rid of multiplication and division. That's outside of the parentheses. So the multiplication and division comes after the adding and subtracting. And then you want to get rid of any exponents that are outside of the parentheses. Is step 3. And then you'll be left with the parentheses. You'll be left with something inside the parentheses. So that's the last thing you do basically is to get rid of the operations inside the parentheses. So inside the parentheses is really more like the fourth thing you need to do. But you kind of start over for PEMDAS with adding and subtracting. So get rid of adding and subtracting again. Inside the parentheses, get rid of multiplication and division. And then any exponents inside parentheses, which this number 3 usually doesn't happen inside the parentheses, but it could occasionally happen. All right, so let's look at our first example. Can I have you guys copy this?
Bathroom and bleeding.
Go ahead and copy this. We have f of x equals 5 parentheses x minus 4 to the third. Okay, so our step 1 is the same. I gotta change this f of x to y. My f of x changes to y. Everything else stays the same. Okay, and then step 2 is to do what? Flip the y and the x. So y now becomes x. And the x now becomes a y. And everything else stays the same. All right, this is where we are talking about PEMDAS. So please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. We're doing it in reverse. So remember, what does the P stand for? Parentheses. The parentheses should be the last thing you get rid of, okay? So notice I have parentheses here. This is the very last thing I want to get rid of. So I need to ignore this y minus 4 right here. And then exponents is the second to the last. So then I also kind of ignore this. And then I do anything that's below the exponent. So I have the 5 left over on the front. If I block off this part here, the y minus 4 in the cube, that only leaves me with the 5 on the outside of the parentheses. So I have to get rid of anything outside of the parentheses. So how do I get rid of this 5 here? Is there an addition symbol here somewhere? No, so it's not adding or subtracting. This is actually multiplying. If it's next to it, it's multiplying. So I have to get rid of the multiplication. What is the inverse of multiplication? Division. So divide both sides by 5. And then the 5's cancel. And I'm left with x over 5, which is really 1/5 x equals y minus 4 to the third. Okay? Do I have anything else left over on the outside of the parentheses? Outside of the parentheses, now I get the exponent. So I can't really do anything else here. So now I move on to the exponents. So how do I get rid of the exponent of 3? I kind of talked about it a few minutes ago. To get rid of the cube, it's called the cube root. So you put a little 3 in the index, and then you draw your radical. So the 3 is kind of like on the v part of the radical. And you do it to both sides. That's called the cube root. Instead of square root, it's called a cube root because we're getting rid of a cube. So then I'm left with the cube root of 1/5 x equals, the cube root cancels out the cube, and I'm left with the y minus 4, which is what was on the inside of the parenthesis. So now I'm working with the parenthesis. So then I start over from the bottom. Get rid of adding and subtracting, then multiplying and dividing, and then exponent. Notice I have that negative 4 left over next to the y. So how do I do the inverse of subtracting 4? Add 4 to each side. But that 4 cannot go on the inside of the radical. This radical is only over like the x right there. So the plus 4 really goes right here after the radical. Okay? So this is going to be the cube root of 1/5 x with the plus 4 on the outside of the radical. And that's going to equal y. Like you need to see the rest of it? Or you needed me to do that?
Oh, no, I forgot to write the problem.
Oh. All right, so then I have the y by itself, so then what do? Last step is to do what? Rewrite the y, move it to the front. I'm going to write inverse notation. This is a f of x, so this becomes f inverse of x equals the cube root of 1/5 x. I made that go farther than it needed to. The cube root, the radical, only goes over the x, okay? So be careful with that. And then you have the plus 4 on the outside of the radical. All right. And I know usually the first example is kind of difficult or confusing, so let's go over another example together, and then I'll kind of call you guys more to help me. All right, can you guys please copy this one? We got the d of x is equal to 1 over 2 times x cubed and a plus 10 at the end. All right, what's my very first step? Change the function notation to y. Thank you. So d of x becomes y. Everything else stays the same. Okay, what's my step 2? So y becomes x, and an x becomes a y. Everything else stays the same. All right, then when I start solving, I need to look at PEMDAS in reverse. So please excuse my dear Aunt Sally in reverse. So starting from the bottom, I get rid of any adding or subtraction outside of the parentheses. Do I have any parentheses this time? No. So really my last step is to get rid of the exponents, okay? My highest thing on here is an exponent. That's the last thing I want to get rid of, okay? So I need to get rid of the 10, and I need to get rid of the 1/2, but I have to follow this order. Which one am I going to get rid of first? The 10, because that's an adding or subtracting is the first thing you get rid of, okay? So that's a plus 10, so what's the inverse of adding 10? Subtracting 10 to both sides. And I get a x minus 10 equals a 1/2 y cubed. All right, so now I'm left with the 1/2 and the cubed next to the y. But again, the exponent is what I get rid of last. I need to get rid of the fraction by doing what? What did we do on Tuesday to get rid of fractions? Multiply by the reciprocal. Good. So 1 over 2 is going to become 2 over 1. And do that to both sides, 2 over 1. But really, what's 2 divided by 1? That's just 2, right? So this is 2 times x gives you what? And 2 times negative 10 equals, the fractions cancel, and I'm left with the y cubed. So now I can get rid of the exponent by doing what? Cube root. Good, thank you. So it's the cube root of both sides. And notice that when you write this, the 3 doesn't go like in the front. The 3 is inside the little v part of the radical. So be careful when you guys write that there. So this is now the cube root of 2x minus 20 equals y, because the cube root cancels out the cubed. And then my last step is to write it in inverse notation. Notice this is a d of x, so when I rewrite it, I write it as what? D inverse of x equals 1/2. Sorry, I was rewriting the top. Thank you. This is the cube root of 2x minus 20. All right. I don't know how comfortable you guys feel yet, but maybe when you guys practice one, so go ahead and practice this one and see how you feel with this one. Remember though, you get rid of the parentheses at the very end. So first you're going to have to get rid of the 4, and then the cubed, and then the -6. So you guys are trying this one on your own. That's on the outside of the parentheses. You get rid of anything outside of the parentheses first. So subtract 4 to each side. We get a x minus 4 equals a y minus 6 cubed. All right, then following PEMDAS in reverse, what do you get rid of after? The cubed or the -6? What do we do first? The cubed. So how do we get rid of a cubed? Take the cube root of each side, right? So then I have the cube root of x minus 4 equals the y minus 6, because the cube root and the cube cancel. And then what's the last thing here? To get the y by itself, we do what? Add 6 to each side. But this is where I saw like a few of you messed up here. Remember this, under the radical, I cannot do anything. So this is like basically done there. Then you add the 6 on the outside of the radical, okay? You cannot add the 6 to the -4 because the -4 is under the cube root, okay? So this is really the cube root of x minus 4 with the plus 6 on the outside, and that equals y on this side. Okay? And then my very, very last step is to change it back to inverse. This was h of x, so what did you guys call this one? H inverse. Good. H inverse of x equals the cube root of x minus 4 with a plus 6 on the outside. Okay. All right. But again, as I was walking around, I only saw like 3 of you guys with the correct answer. But I get to check everybody, so there might be more of you that had it. All right, this is going to be our last example for today. And then you guys get to work on the assignment after this one, okay? So go ahead and copy this one, and again, it's a practice, so you guys are trying this one on your own. So what do we do to get rid of the 1/4? I saw as walking around, some of you guys did minus 1/4 to each side, but do you see an addition or subtraction symbol next to the 1/4? There's no addition or subtraction, so you shouldn't subtract 1/4 because you're not adding it to the y plus 8. So for this one, in order to get rid of the 1/4, we have to multiply by what? The reciprocal, so it'd be 4/1 to each side. But really, 4/1 is the same thing as what? 4. So this is a 4x equals, on the right side, the 1/4 and the 4/1 cancel. So we're left with y plus 8 to the 3rd. So remember, you have to get rid of everything on the outside of the parentheses. So what's the only thing that's still on the outside of the parentheses? The exponent. So to get rid of it, we do the cube root of each side. We get the cube root of 4x equals, the cube root cancels out the cubed, and we're left with the y plus 8, which is what's inside the parentheses. So now I gotta get the y by itself by getting rid of this plus 8. So what's the inverse of adding 8? Subtracting 8 to each side, but again, that goes on the outside of the radical. So this is going to be the cube root of 4x minus 8 on the outside equals y. And then the very last step is to go back to inverse notation. This is a g of x, so what are we going to call it? G inverse of x. Good. Equals the cube root of 4x minus 8. And that's our final answer. All right, so you guys have about 6 minutes left. So for the rest of the period, you guys are working on the 6-5 homework. The ones with the cubes, which I forget what they were. It's numbers, I think, 4, 6, 8. And there's another one, right? Okay, so your homeworks are numbers 3, 4, 6, and 8. Because those are the ones with the 3s, with the cubes. And then tomorrow, I'll show you guys how to do the ones with the squares. And then we'll do the other part of the homework in class tomorrow. Okay?